Hi there, and welcome to The Artist Craft. I'm your host, Stacey Cochran, and today's guest is going to be Alexandra Sokoloff, author of The Harrowing. Thanks so much for being on the show today.
I'm thrilled to be here, thanks.
So for the next half hour or so, we're going to be asking a lot of questions about how Alex became a writer, some of her background as a screenwriter as well, some of her background in California, and the road and path that led her to be a successful novelist. So how did growing up in California as a young person influence you?
Well, I didn't just grow up in California, I grew up in Berkeley, which is just not like any other place in the universe. Mm-hmm. It's a good atmosphere for a writer because it's so surreal that you learn to think in fictional terms. But I think that what you're really getting at, knowing you, is that California made it very easy for me to decide to go into the arts as a profession because that's where people go to do that kind of thing. And there's a whole mythos about California that it's the gold rush. You go there to make your fortune, you go there for fame and fortune, there's the whole Hollywood thing. You grew up with that as it's the dream machine. So I think that I was very privileged to have been born there because it always made it possible to pursue my dream.
Sure, and so how did your parents influence your decision early on to go into the arts?
Oh, they hated it. I mean, no parent wants their kid to go into the arts, you know, because they have a genetic, I think, understanding of how hard it is. My parents are scientists. They didn't get that at all. And they really wanted me to go into something, well, science first, or something logical and practical, law, or be a doctor, or any of those things. So, no, they're still stunned that I'm making a living at this.
But now as a kid, you played classical piano, right?
Well, yeah. At the same time that they were trying to get us to do practical things, we were being trained, my brother and sister and I, in arts and music and dance and all of the, and going to museums. So they really gave us all those art. And I say to this day, Mom, what did you think was going to happen? You know, so yeah, they gave us the background without really knowing it.
Do you still play the piano today?
Not when anyone's listening.
But you actually have a piano?
Oh yeah, I do have a piano in the house. It's very relaxing. I mean, it's a great way to work out story problems.
I know in The Harrowing you referenced the marriage of Figaro early on as one of the students is listening to that down the hallway or something.
Right, yeah, well I went to Berkeley as a school too, and I knew a lot of opera singers, so yeah, that was just part of my Berkeley experience, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Now, describe the experience of directing a play at 16, is that right?
Yeah, I had been acting since I was just a kid. That was the first thing that I fell in love with. Yeah, I wanted to do a senior class play, and there wasn't a senior class play going on. And so I just said, well, let's do it. Mm-hmm. And I had been taking theater classes, and I was interested in the big picture. So, and then I, at 16, really got off on the power that being a director is, because suddenly everyone, and it was all like the popular students, and everybody wanted to be in the play, and I had total and absolute control over their lives. It was really quite a rush.
So how did you select the material that you used for the play? What was the play that you actually performed?
That was an easy call. MASH was a hugely popular TV show when I was in high school. Everybody was just, it was like the last year or something, and everybody watched it. And we had many more guys who were interested in doing it, and there is a play version of MASH that a lot of high schools put on, and it was just a no-brainer that was the one that we could cast, and it was a blast. It came off so well, and you know, when you have that successful an experience, you're going to, of course, keep going with it.
Now, right around that same time, you lived in Istanbul, Turkey, correct?
Yes, I was an exchange student.
What was that experience like?
That was really hard. It was the most transformative experience of my life.
How old were you?
I was 16. I did that before I directed the play, actually. It actually came in that progression. I spent the summer of I graduated early, so or no, I didn't. I had skipped a grade. Anyway, I got out of there as soon as I could. So I went to Turkey for a summer. It was 4 months total. And it was really, really hard. I was 16 years old, blonde American teenager, on my own. It's still, I mean, it was at the time, and I imagine it still is, a very sexist country. And I was in danger all the time. I would go out on the street, I would be sexually harassed. There were abduction attempts. It's amazing that I lived through it. But it's also an amazing historical place to be. Being on my own and being in that kind of danger was really transformative as a writer, because I was totally in my own head and totally independent at that age. And it also, I really thought at 16 that I was going to die any minute, that I could die any minute. And usually you have that experience in your 40s and 50s, like it's called a midlife crisis, when you realize you're going to die and you might as well do what you want, and you go off and do crazy things. I did that when I was 16, and that's when I decided to just never mind what my parents had programmed me toward, a rational professional life.
So was it primarily the experience of living in Turkey that caused that, sort of premature anxiety, or was that something that was in place before living in Turkey?
No, it was totally about Turkey. It was that I was so lucky to live in the U.S. because of the opportunity we have here. Because as a woman, you can do what men do in this country. Any place else, you're pretty much screwed. And that idea that I was going to die, I could die, so I was going to, if I ever survived the experience, do what I wanted to do, what I loved, which was, at the time, acting.
Now, were you writing at that age between, say, 16 and 20?
I wasn't, except in journals, which is everybody who ends up a writer probably journals. And I would, when I directed things, I would write incidental stuff. I wrote a couple of musical reviews, but I wasn't thinking about being a writer at the time. It was just part of the theatrical experience.
So how did your theater experience at UC Berkeley then shape you, and how was that transition? So it sounds like you were interested in theater, maybe despite your parents' better judgment, in your teen years.
That's
and
right.
you get to Berkeley, you're a smart, bright student, top of the class type student, and you decide to go the theater route, is that right?
Yeah. Well, I had decided in Turkey that I would major in theater. Before, I was going to be a psychologist or a lawyer. And in Turkey, it was just like, no, I'm going into theater. But I didn't tell my parents that. I just waited till I went to Berkeley. And once I was out of the house and my siblings were, they just wanted us to get a liberal education, and they weren't looking over our shoulders. So I just majored in theater.
And you were doing some singing at the time, right?
Yes.
Well, now, were you seriously considering going into singing at that point, or was it just sort of a lark?
Oh, it was just part of the whole theater training. I did a lot of musical theater. That was what I was best at. I actually am a much better dancer than singer, and I love being in musicals. Shakespeare and musicals, it's my favorite performance. So no, I was never serious about it.
So talk a little bit about how that experience at Berkeley, and particularly in the theater program, shaped you as a writer today. Do you think it did?
It had everything to do with what kind of writer I am and the fact that I'm a writer. Theater training, I think, is the best background you can have as a writer. You have to walk through a story as an actor. As a choreographer, you have to put together the whole flow and sensuality of a story. As a director, you have to deal with the visual. You have to deal with structural issues. You learn how to write by doing all of those things. And because I'm a suspense and horror writer, so having that kind of visceral theatrical experience and having the instant feedback of an audience, that's made me able to create the kind of sensory experience that you have to create for a reader if you want them to be terrified, which is what I do, hopefully, and do well. And I think it has to do with musical theater. Don't ask me, but it does have to do with rhythm and sensuality, and that.
Well, you definitely learn about pacing, I would think, and dialogue is absolutely crucial. Well, it makes sense reading your biography then that your transition, your next phase would then be into screenwriting. You're in Southern California, you're studying theater, you know, there are tons of connections, I would think, through the University of California at Berkeley.
No.
So
No.
Talk about that process.
Berkeley was not a practical program at all. I mean, they taught theory, and we did a lot of practical stuff ourselves. You're right that California, you got the idea that you could go down to LA and be a screenwriter. But I didn't have any connections at all. I just sort of moved down there. But I was thinking, I need to make a living. And I wasn't going to make a living at the kind of theater we were doing at Berkeley, which is political and just obscure. But in California, being a screenwriter is a practical plan. And I didn't know anyone, but I took the most practical route into it. I became a story analyst, a reader for studios, which is I got paid per script and book to read, write a synopsis, and evaluate the potential for film development. And that is the #1 route into screenwriting.
How soon after graduation did you land that job? Was that something that happened right away, or did you struggle like a lot of writers, you know, working at a fast food joint or anything like that? I mean, how quickly after graduation did you find that position?
It was very fast. I actually, for a couple of years after graduation, I was in a theater company and I was working for a video production company in San Francisco. I did odd jobs, but I never waited tables because I just can't. I just could never do that. But I worked as I worked in a movie theater, which was also great training as a writer. And I worked in bookstores, I worked in libraries, you know, so. I didn't get paid much, but.
Now, how many screenplays did you write between that period and a number of years later when The Harrowing was published? How many screenplays did you write during that period?
Well, after I got my first job as a screenwriter or sold my first script, I worked very steadily as a screenwriter, doing novel adaptations or selling original work. It's a good question because I don't really know, but I would say probably 24 that I was paid one way or another to do.
Now, for our audience, we have a lot of folks who are watching who might be writers themselves or screenwriters. How did you actually break through and find your agent as a screenwriter?
Well, again, this is how most screenwriters do it. They're living in LA, they get this job as a story analyst, and what I did was an agent submits these things that I'm reading. I just took notes. I kept files of every agent who submitted things in my genre, because what I always write, suspense, horror, crime, psychological thrillers. So anyone who had a great script in that genre, I would note that agent's name and the script and everything. And when I had my script that I wanted to sell, needed to get an agent, I just called those agents up and I said, I'm a reader from this company. I've read these scripts from these clients. I really think that you would like this script that I'm working on. And they all said, send it. It was very easy, and I got a great agent. I had my pick of agents, really.
That's really smart. It sounds like you were kind of methodical about it and taking your time and you were patient. Now, were there any screenplays that you actually discovered that were made into films during that period, or what was that process like? Well,
actually, I had an overnight read of The Firm, that Tom Cruise, John Grisham novel that nobody had heard of, and my production company didn't win that bidding war, but I was on the phone after the first 5 pages saying, you have to buy this.
Wow.
Yeah, but there were a lot. I mean, and a lot of scripts that I read that I still really wish had been made into some other version of the movie that ended up being made. It's kind of tragic when you see what happens.
Sounds like a great learning experience.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if you're just tuning in, we're here with writer Alexandra Sokoloff, and her upcoming book is The Price, and we're going to get into talking about that a little bit. Available now is her novel The Harrowing as well. So talk a little bit more about the differences between writing an original screenplay and writing an adaptation of a novel? Is it easier to write an original screenplay?
No, I don't. It's much easier to write an adaptation. Not that it's easy, but the process is easier because you have the book, and so the various people that you work with, the producers, the executives, the studio executives, the director, sometimes a lead actor, you usually have 6 or 7 different people in the room with you making these decisions. If you're lucky, there's only 6 or 7. So if you have a book, then at least you're working with some source material that everyone can say, well, I liked this chapter and I liked this, and we want to change that. But when you're writing off a pitch, you just don't have the same base of reference. So, and also people are a little bit more respectful of a book if you're working with that, but sometimes not.
So now, you were reading scripts and you were keeping note of the various agents who were submitting to these different production companies, and you came across a few that you said, okay, I really like the scripts they're submitting. When you went to contact these, the one that you ended up signing with, what was that experience like? Did you phone them? Did you mail them? How did you contact the agent?
Yeah, I just called them. Cold called and said, you always talk to the assistant first, but everyone put me through because I had this legitimate job. It's not that hard if you go through the proper channels. It really isn't. But and if you're not living in LA, it's harder. But the way that you do it if you're not living in LA is you try to place in one of the prestigious contests. The screenwriting contests, and that's another way. It's an open door. Those people who are the top 5 placers in the Goldwyn Awards or the Nichols Fellowship, those people are guaranteed agent attention and probably signing. And I have lists of those on my website. If people are really interested in that, they should go and look at my list of those breakdowns.
And that website is?
AlexandraSokoloff.com, yeah.
Okay. Now talk about the experience of working on Cold Kisses.
Well, it was a perfect experience in every way, which never happens in Hollywood. It was a German production from a German novel, and I was working with a writing partner, and we had worked with this director before who did American movies and also European movies. He had the financing to do this movie, really wanted us to write it, and said, if you will do this for me, I'll shoot it word for word, which just never happens. It was a very, it was a psychological thriller. It was really intense about sexual abuse and prostitutes and this serial killer that was killing. It was just all about women's issues in a way that you could never portray them in the US. And Carl said yes, he would do it the way we wanted to. And that's what happened. We wrote the script, and he and the producer fought the studio down the line to keep the intensity of the scenes, and it came out beautifully. But that was when I really realized that I was not going to have that experience again in Hollywood, and I really wanted to start thinking about writing novels instead.
Now, Carl Schenkel has passed away, right?
Yes,
What was it like when you found out that news?
It was devastating. Carl is an amazing talent and an amazing person. That was very hard.
As a screenwriter, what did you want, or what do you want from a director?
Total obedience. Which is never going to happen. As a screenwriter, you are totally obedient to the director. I've worked with some incredible directors, and in fact, The Harrowing was the book. The novel was originally a screenplay, and I had written that, and I had a top director in mind. My absolute first choice all along was Brad Anderson, who did the magnificent independent film Session 9, one of the scariest things I've ever seen, The Machinist, Next Stop Wonderland. And that we had a list of 10, but he was the one I wanted, and we got him right away. And he got the script, he made it, everything that we talked about made it so much more than I had ever expected a movie could be. It was the ideal experience, and then we lost him to another movie, and which happens all the time in Hollywood. That's why things don't get made. And I was so devastated by that, because I knew we would never get that kind of synergy again. And that's when I decided, no, I want the rights back, I'm going to do it as a novel instead. And then I can think about setting it up as a movie again, but this is it, I'm going to write a novel now.
So what was the process like writing a novel, and how was that different than writing screenplays?
Well, it was kind of like directing a screenplay onto the page. In this case, I had the script. You have to use a lot more words, and you have to be a lot more internal. But I had directed before, and so that's the process. I went in there, looking at the page, taking the script and going, okay, how do I put this experience like a movie into a reader's head? And so layer by layer, I would put in the atmosphere and the internal dialogue and the sound effects and the musical mood thing and the character, you know, and everything. So it really was like directing a dream that goes straight into the reader's head and creating that suspense and tension and terror.
And you had the screenplay, like you said, to start with, so that was sort of, was it working kind of as an outline?
It was
for
the
you?
outline, yeah. It works exactly as an outline. It's the structure, and yeah, then you have to put 5 times as much material into it.
Now, did it feel like you were going out on a ledge when you said, okay, I'm tired of being a screenwriter, and there's just, the odds of having a successful project are, you know, are very difficult. What was that process like when you said, okay, I'm going to try to write novels. I've got an agent. I know the business pretty well. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, at first it was easy because I was working on a film job for a major director at the time, and I was adapting a novel, and by that time I had realized I'm doing this in the wrong order. I should be writing the book first so that someone is, you know, trying to adapt my book so I was having a terrible time doing that, and I would come home in a rage, or I was home most of the time, and I would write 1 hour a night on the novel. It was sheer fury, which is a good fuel, I find, for getting things done. And once I had gotten to the end of it, I thought, oh my God, I really have a novel here and I need to get serious. And that's when I hooked up with a writing group and really started committing to the process.
And you were still living in California at the time,
Oh yeah,
correct?
Absolutely.
Now, how long did it take you to write the novel itself from start to finish?
It's so hard to say because I was working really 10 hours a day on another job, but it took me about a year from start to finish, but I had breaks in between. But I had already written the screenplay, so it's hard to quantify, but I would say it was about a year.
Okay. Well, you've got a workbook here today, so let's take a look at that and talk a little bit about the process of writing and how the workbook informs some of the things that you actually write.
Yeah, I brought this in because I think it's interesting for any writers who are out there. This is what in Hollywood is called a mood book. Directors usually do this, but I picked it up really early on. I just collage people who I see as the characters, just the colors, shots that, in this case, who's going to be in it, or an image, a theme that I'm looking for, the woman as temptress, the androgyny of this, I don't know how well people can see it, but
Sure.
The masculine, feminine, and then this androgynous thing. So it really helps, I think, to find images that you can work with as a writer, because it specifies, it brings that whole sensory specific detail into your work.
Now, do you outline as well?
Yes, about 75 pages. Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
your new novel, which is coming out just after New Year's 2008, The Price, that was part of a two-book deal, correct?
Right.
So talk about some of the differences between writing a novel, you know, writing The Harrowing, which you didn't have a deal for at the time, and then The Price, knowing that you had a publisher.
Actually, writing The Harrowing was a lot easier because I didn't have any expectation from it. And I didn't have to self-promote. As you know, marketing is a huge part of the job of being a novelist. And with The Price, I was writing, first of all, it's a harder story. It's a darker one and more adult and bigger canvas. But I also was on the road most of the time doing the book tours, doing the signings for The Harrowing. I got nominated for the Stoker Award for The Harrowing, and I had to, you know, do those. I mean, I love it, it's great, but the interviews and things like that take a lot of time. And you have to do that, especially as a debut novelist. You're just out of town all the time. So I found that a lot harder to work on it.
Well, we're coming down to a couple of minutes left in the interview. Speaking of awards, you were just notified of your nomination as we're shooting here in the studio yesterday, in fact, of being nominated for an Anthony Award, which, if you're watching the program and you don't know what that is, it's a very prestigious Mystery Writers Award given at BoucherCon, an annual mystery convention. What does being just nominated, let alone if you win the thing, what does being nominated do for a debut novelist in terms of your standing at the publisher and with reviewers? And
it's huge. It's huge. I've had email all day from all kinds of reviewers and best-selling novelists, and everybody looks at those awards, and it gives you just a prestige and a glow that is just incalculably valuable. Of course, your publisher is thrilled with you, and it's really great that when I'm negotiating a new contract that this has just happened, so there's not a single downside to it. It's an amazing thing. And it's also because the Anthony is a mystery award and the Stoker is a horror award, it makes me realize that I did hit both of those audiences, and that's the line I've been trying to do with my thrillers. So it's an amazing thing.
That's awesome. Well, we've got about 30 seconds left here, so let's toss it over to you. And then the question that I have is, what advice would you give to someone who learns tomorrow that St. Martin's Press is going to publish their first 2 novels?
Oh gosh, you need to join the organizations in your genre, Sisters in Crime or International Thriller Writers, Mystery Writers of America, so that you have other writers telling you what to do. You need to join the email lists, the Yahoo lists that are out there. There are great resources, and read the books on how to promote yourself, because you're going to need all the help that you can get. And if, again, people go to my website, I have an internet resources for writers list that is a really good place to start, because it's just too big a question to answer here.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in this evening to The Artist's Craft. I am your host, Stacey Cochran, and I'd like to thank Alexandra Sokoloff for being on the show. Thank you.
Thanks.
I think that's...
Flew by.